Hi there, I'm Simon, and I'm a teacher and a trainer and a manager. Um, I'm also nearly 53 years old, and so that probably makes me the grumpy professional I mentioned in the title of this talk. Um, Maybe I'm grumpy because I've been involved in ELT for more than 30 years. Uh, my talk today is a little bit about my story in recent years, and especially about why I've become quite grumpy. And also what I've been doing to stop being quite so grumpy because I don't really want to be. So my story and my ELT career, I guess, seemed to be going quite smoothly up until 2020, 2021. Although I was probably already becoming quite grumpy, I think. But like almost everyone else in the world, I suddenly had all kinds of new worries and problems that I hadn't experienced before. Leaving China in a hurry in 2020 and dealing with all of the complications of running a school in China from the UK, including suddenly having to do everything online, probably exacerbated my burnout and anxiety. And I think I became quite poorly, which meant it was almost impossible to work for a while. Fortunately, I found a good counsellor to help me with my problems, and she definitely helped me begin to recover. However, part of recovering your mental health seems to require making sense of what's happened so far and also thinking about what to do next. That part of looking into the future with positivity seemed to be a bit of a problem for me. Well, it was about this time that I heard a new expression. It was, well, new, at least for me. Perhaps many of you are already familiar with it. But as I looked for things to be positive about, the idea of toxic positivity felt very real. To me, it felt like the world was pushing me to feel and express myself in a particular way that I wasn't sure about or ready for. The problem that trying to be positive might be toxic affected me in, I think, two different ways. One way was related to my own recovery, but it also made me think about my role as a manager, a trainer, and a teacher, all roles in which I'm expected to support others. And I became worried that I was possibly toxically positive in my dealings with others. I didn't want to be that kind of manager or teacher. So, how can I do it differently? One of the ways that my story may differ from others, and I'm sure it's a very common story amongst most of my colleagues, is where I started searching to find ways of making sense of the situation. At the same time as doing all of the other things that people do to make themselves feel better, like, I don't know, yoga and lots of exercise and stuff, I also got dragged back into what I always do when I'm confused. I've started reading a lot of philosophy again. And it's in philosophy that I started to make sense in a new way for me. And it's those ideas that I want to share with you today. Now, first, let me apologize if some of these ideas I'm going to talk about seem a bit weird or confusing at first. I promise I'll keep it short and I'll try to include some examples to help. But there's a good chance that the big idea may not be immediately apparent. Uh, I know for me, the oh yeah moment came months after I started reading about this stuff. It was in the middle of the night and I woke up suddenly with a jolt. At first, I thought I must have been hungry or needed to go to the bathroom. But actually, it turned out that I'd been woken up by a lot of questions hitting me at the same time. So the hero of my story today really is Gilles Deleuze. Now he's not really a big name in ELT, although he does have a devoted following in things like gender studies and lots of other areas. Where he was obviously French, and he died quite recently for a philosopher. So we've only really just started on trying to make sense of some of his big ideas. Perhaps the big idea to start with comes from his last book called What is Philosophy? You'd think that after 3,000 years of philosophy, somebody would have done this before, but his ideas are surprisingly original. The big idea is that for most philosophers, the job of philosophy has been to describe the world, to find the truth, and to work out how people should live. But Deleuze wasn't really interested in that approach. Instead, he saw philosophy as a creative process. The philosopher creates concepts in a similar way to the way an artist creates a painting or a musician creates music. The concept I'm talking about today is the idea of positive and negative difference. Okay, so here we go. Right, what can you see? You've probably identified an orange and an apple, right? So, next step, how are they different? Okay, so I don't want to tell you what you're thinking, but probably you did something like this. You probably thought of what an orange is like, and then probably you thought of what an apple is like, and then the idea of difference is introduced between them. Deleuze calls this negative difference. So just to try again, right? So number one, we start by identifying the objects or ideas, and then two, we impose the idea of difference on them, between them. So difference could be seen as a quality between the apple and the orange. Is that okay so far? Now, you might seem a little puzzled, but just stay with me for a second. Okay, so here's another way of doing the same thing. So Deleuze calls this positive difference, and it's probably not the way that we usually do it. This time, let's start with the idea of difference first. So the difference is before the identity. Now we introduce the objects. This time, the apple and the orange kind of feel different. Because the concept of positive difference comes first, of course the orange and the apple are different from each other, because everything will be inevitably different from everything else when we start with difference. In addition, it may also occur to us that the orange is not only different from the apple, well, the apple is different from the orange, but the fruit are also, they're different from themselves. Now, if that seems a bit too much to take in one go, okay, let's go back to the idea of negative difference. So remember that negative difference prioritizes identity. So it encourages us to reinforce the idea of orangeness or appleness. The difference between them, well, that becomes a bit of an afterthought. So here's a quick summary of positive and negative difference so far. I'll leave you to look at the screen for a couple of seconds. Now, if you've started to guess in advance about the idea of, well, which one of these is the best one, because, well, the presenter always tells us two things and then tells us which one is the best, don't they? Well, I don't want to say that one is the best. They're just two ways of making sense of the world. But by thinking which one is Simon going to tell me is the best, you've already anticipated the next step. So Deleuze would probably want to say that negative and positive difference are actually part of the same thing. But what is interesting to consider is which of the two concepts do we seem to use naturally? Again, Deleuze would probably say that it's not natural, but it is a habit that we picked up over the last 3,000 years of thinking. He calls it the dogmatic image of thought. And the way that works is, well, if you were anticipating which one I was going to describe as the best a couple of minutes ago, that was the dogmatic image of thought at work. Our patterns of thinking tend to search to define and identify objects and ideas. And once we've done that, we also want to decide which one of them is the best. For example, I could say a concept like mind and body as an example. And can you feel your thoughts inevitably trying to work out the either or of this concept? Are you being drawn to either mind or body as something that you, I don't know, think is better or more important or more real or something like that? You probably ended up with a sense of which one is best, even without really thinking about it. Deleuze would say that we do this all the time, with everything really, but definitely with concepts. So heaven and hell, subject and object, man and woman. Positive difference, on the other hand, gets kind of beneath negative difference. It surrounds it. If we start with the difference, we can still see and use identity, but identity also becomes something that will inevitably change. Okay, so maybe that's enough pure philosophy for now. So here are some examples of how I've experienced this concept in recent times as I've become more aware of it. The first is related to academic management, and it's something that I've talked about in talks and articles before. You may even recognize this image, which is David Snowden's Cynefin framework. And this framework is to help leaders, managers, make sense of different types of situations. Now, personally, I find this framework really useful, but as always with these things, there's always something that kind of niggles, and actually it kind of I think it niggles David Snowden too, because he keeps changing small parts of it. But in particular, it's the idea here of something called the domain of best practice. So, I mean, the idea of best practice is very common in all areas of management. I'm sure you must have heard the expression before. We use it a lot in education. In fact, here's a screenshot of a Google Scholar search I did only last week. So there are always new articles using the term best practice all of the time. And actually, I bet there's someone here at IATEFL that is using the term in one of their presentations this week. However, the term best practice bothers me, and maybe it's bothered me for a while, but I didn't always know why. Well, if you remember Deleuze's idea of the dogmatic image of thought, then the problem might be obvious, because best practice, or the term best practice at least, could be seen as narrowing the range of thought, kind of identifying a single superior way to do something. So that there's only one best way. So when it comes to either or, well, we know exactly what to do. Now, you may say that that could be a good thing, right? Knowing exactly what to do. And that's exactly the way that David Snowden uses it when describing situations that he describes as are simple or obvious. Perhaps best practice is the solution when common sense leads us to a single answer. However, that doesn't seem to be the way that things usually are in academic management. And actually, I kind of don't want them to be. Most of the time, I'm aware that there are multiple answers to the same questions. All of them are equally or relatively equally appropriate. In these situations, what I really want is both something and something else, and probably something else. And let's keep an open mind to something else coming along. I could guess we could call this good practice, actually, although there are probably lots of names for this. But my point here is that when it comes to positive and negative difference in educational practice, good can be better than the best, because good is multiple and it doesn't limit our options. If you want to experience this, just try and working with a group of CELTA or Delta trainers trying to work out a course schedule. They all have different ideas that are all good. They all work, There's just no one agreed best way. So, talking of CELTA, I was lucky enough earlier this year to be a trainer on my first face-to-face training course for more than 3 years. And the experience of being in a real room with real people was quite exhilarating after years of Zoom. And it got me thinking about how positive difference kind of works in real life. How do we experience it? I'm sure most of you have at some point taken up Jim Scrivener's encouragement to draw a map of your classroom. So anyway, here's mine. One day I'm sitting at the back of the classroom observing some teaching practice. So you can probably see which cross is me. So here's where I'm starting. So here I am, my little cross, sitting at the back of the CELTA TP room, observing as one by one the teacher trainees take their turns to teach a group of very patient students. And I kind of start to draw lines on my map. What are the lines? What connections can I make? Well, I mean, one of the obvious lines that I begin to draw is how the teacher interacts with the learners and how they develop their rapport. Now, that's something that we always do on CELTA courses. But it also becomes apparent to me that obviously that's not enough to define what's going on. And I immediately feel that the dogmatic image of thought is limiting my experience. Somehow that way of thinking is limiting me to either this or that, when I know that actually a lot more is going on than just that. So I start to add more lines. So maybe these lines suggest the classroom dynamic between the learners too. And I begin to feel it gets better as the kind of the lines become more messy and overlapping. But I still know that this is not enough. It's still making me feel either or. So I keep adding more and more lines. And now I think, well, of course, all of the trainees are part of this process as well, right? So maybe not at this moment in the middle of a lesson, but definitely in the past and definitely in the future as well. So I keep adding more lines. And as I'm adding more lines and it becomes more complex, it seems to feel better. I just realized that there's also me. So I have some kind of connection with all of the people in the room. In some ways, I feel I'm like a kind of conductor whose job is to keep the whole thing moving together. But then I realized that that's not really true either, as I don't want them to all play the same song at the same time. So I know that there are dozens of individual songs, as well as hundreds and thousands of other kind of tunes and melodies that are going on between this group of people. So I finally get to realize that I've been making the mistake of limiting the connections to the current room all along. All of the connections move across time and with people and places and ideas that are outside the room, in all kinds of ways. The map has now become really a mess, right? There's no easy way to describe the complexity anymore. I'm becoming aware that I can't draw a map of this level of complexity with all of the possible connections that there might be. Claire Colebrook simply describes Deleuze's concept of positive difference as that difference is life. And to Deleuze, all difference leads to connection. Everything is always becoming different from everything else as it connects with everything else, always connecting in different ways. He encourages us to make sense of this by looking for something he calls the lines of flight. How are the connections being made in new and unexpected ways? What are they leading from and what are they leading towards? So I'll leave you with a little thought experiment that's closely related to the idea of learning, I suppose. As I mentioned at the start, Deleuze's idea of philosophy isn't to define what truth is or how you should live. He's offering concepts of how we could live. How can we be creative in making sense of the world? Well, while you're in Harrogate, you should, if you get some free time, visit the Turkish baths. They're a very nice thing to do. And while there, as this experiment goes, get into the cold pool and immerse yourself in the water. How do you feel? The chances are that the immediate feeling that floods in is kind of shock. Survival instincts take over, and you get a very heightened sense of yourself and your self-preservation. We could probably see this as an example of negative difference. A desperate refocusing on the identity, your you-ness. There's probably a strong initial feeling of either or, right? It's kind of like you or the water, the desperate urge to get out of the water, even possibly life or death, if that's the way that it can feel. However, what happens if you kind of got the stamina and the patience to relax and begin to float and maybe even begin to enjoy it? How do you experience the difference differently? How do you begin to feel new lines of flight between your body and the water? New options, new ideas begin to emerge, and you may start to feel that your mind begins to think about this idea of both and, rather than just limiting things to either or. This idea actually comes from a book by Todd May, and he's using this example of swimming when he applies Deleuze's concepts to the process of learning. So this on the screen now, you can see a quote from Todd May's book, and actually, if you want to discover a bit more about Deleuze thinking, this is a really good book to start with. So I really recommend it. Writes very well, even though it's not actually by Gilles Deleuze, because in a way, Deleuze's own writing can sometimes be quite challenging, although actually wonderful in its own way. Anyway, so this is how a grumpy 52-year-old suffering from burnout started to make sense of looking for new ways to be positive, a new kind of positivity. Now, I know that for some of you, I can imagine your faces, I know that it might not seem to be the easy or obvious way to do it. I'm sure many of you have found your own ways of kind of feeling positive after difficult times that are in some ways probably much more effective and probably require reading a lot less French philosophy. You could do it through painting, or you could do it through singing in a choir, or you could do it through open water swinging. But this is just a way that seems to work for me. Actually, I think Deleuze himself would say that all of those ways are other ways of doing the same thing in a way. The great thing about it in a way is that it does just pretty much apply to anything. In this talk, I plan to use examples taken from transport policy, actually, about the domination of the motor car. And I'd also got some ideas from the movies of Kazuo Ishiguro. But when I told my wife about it, she wisely suggested me to just, no, don't talk about that. Just keep it focused on ELT. So I guess I'll keep those ideas for an article that I'll need to publish soon. And in the meantime, if you've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. So thanks for listening very much to a grumpy ELT professional, and let's hope it helps a little.